Welcome to this second webinar of the New Normal program that we've organized here on behalf of Strelka. So my name is Nicolay. I'm the design and education tutor of the program. Also was the design education tutor of the normal program, and now also on the faculty of this next program, the Terraforming, that we're doing here at Strelka. So hopefully everyone can hear me, or at least someone can type something in the chat, so it feels like someone is on the other end. But right, welcome to all the viewers. So as I mentioned, this is the kind of great. Thank you. This is kind of a follow-up of the first webinar that we did last week with the program director Benjamin Bratton, where he kind of introduced the core proposition of the program, the key faculty, and some of the core themes of the program. So this particular webinar is not necessarily to rehash some of that stuff, although of course we can do that if there's any kind of questions in the chat. I'm happy to talk about some of that stuff as well. But we thought that maybe we can do a second follow-up on a different set of topics that may be of interest to potential applicants. It's also not necessarily to expand on the more admin components of the program, although similarly, we can also go into the Q&A if you guys have any specific questions. But I think a lot of that stuff could be viewed on the sort of website of the program, and also on the email applied@strelka.com if you guys have any specific questions on administration stuff. So beyond these kind of two topics, maybe what would be useful for some of you guys is maybe to learn more about the experience and the process of being part of the program, as well as the maybe application process of getting into the program, or any kind of specific questions on portfolio or anything like that. So basically, we can use this as an opportunity to basically talk about these questions. Right. So. What we thought we could do is that maybe because we've received quite a large number of emails and kind of similar questions, or questions that are recurring in the emails, I thought I could maybe address some of those points, just kind of as a kind of starter. And meanwhile, if that doesn't answer some of your questions, or if you have any specific questions that you want to kind of have raised, you can also add some to the chat here, and we can just go back and forth. Hopefully that works with everyone. I'll just assume it's a yes. Right, so maybe to go back to the first point, Benjamin talked about the kind of core proposition of the program, and he outlined it quite nicely in the lecture and the book manifesto that we published. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, definitely do. But basically, it's hopefully was apparent that we have a very perhaps differently from the previous program at Strelka, which was called the New Normal, it's slightly a more focused topic of investigation and topic of research. So some of the kind of general questions that we've got about this was basically, what was the experience of being part of such a program? And maybe I can talk about it more generally, starting with the fact that, as with the New Normal, we thought about designing the Terraforming as a type of think tank, as a type of design research think tank institution, a format which would allow different voices and different disciplines to be part of the same space of research, and kind of look at a common set of interests that we hopefully all share. That being said, Strelka is a pretty unique kind of space and a pretty unique educational platform. So I think some of you guys may know this, but Strelka is not necessarily a school or an academic institutions, meaning that even though we are not shy away, we don't shy away from looking at theory and more academic topics, and we are connected with several kind of prominent academics in different fields as part of our faculty. It's not exactly an academic program where you have, grades, exams, where you receive some kind of degree. It's also not an incubator, even though we kind of expect and hope that some of the projects that we develop here have a future after the program, and many of them do. It's not quite an incubator, although some people sometimes feel like it's this kind of thing. And it's also not art residency. Not that there's anything wrong with art residencies, but it's just not this kind of program either. It's really kind of its own unique brand of or at least it's a space where we're trying to experiment with the education format itself. So beyond the research that we're kind of looking at in the program, we're also constantly experimenting with the formats of education. The formats of education that might be needed for the type of practices that we want to encourage to happen. So Strelka is a kind of an institute of media architecture and design, and we focus our research predominantly on this kind of lens of the city or the urban in whatever kind of skewed or stretched out or promiscuous and opportunistic ways that we kind of find. So that being said, the format of education here is actually, and Benjamin mentioned this last time in the previous webinar, is very intensely collaborative, where we are basically trying to, at least in the first 2/3 of the program, really kind of break apart the class, the group, in kind of various different units, and test out different compositions and different collaborations, both for us to look at what would be the interesting kind of overlaps, but also for the researchers themselves to kind of find collaborators and have a chance to collaborate with everyone else, leading to the final group composition. But the point is that the process itself is actually quite intense and quite very much full-time, which is one of the kind of common questions we have often by the applicants. How intense is the program? Is there any kind of time off? Am I going to have time to go back to visit family and so on? The program is very much, 5 to sometimes 6 days a week, depending on the different activities that we have, because we have field trips and things like this. But it's a very intense experience, where in a given week you might be working on 3 different projects in 3 different groups. The point is not to exhaust people, but it's to basically allow this kind of rhythm of design and rhythm of thinking, which is less based on some one beautiful, pristine final idea, at least in the first stage of the program, but actually get into this habit of producing and kind of ideas quickly in iteration, and not being kind of obsessed with the final outcome, both from the point of view of it's a perfect object, but also from the point of view of this has to represent be all and end all and so on. So the most common question I think that we get here is basically how intense is the program, and the short answer is it's pretty intense, based on the fact that we have this this format, which is if we want to create this kind of think tank, speculative urbanism think tank that we're kind of advocating for in the manifesto and in the program, we are essentially interested in kind of seeing what works and what doesn't, and in order to do that, we're actually really prototyping with the group and with the kind of class composition itself throughout the process, which makes it a quite intense process for those who are involved. This is also why the program is so interdisciplinary, given the fact that the topics that we're looking at are quite, they're familiar topics, but we're trying to kind of, especially with the terraforming, look at them in sort of with fresh eyes, or in unfamiliar ways. So familiar topics in unfamiliar ways. And for this to happen, we basically try to admit people to the program from a variety of different backgrounds. So this is kind of mentioned throughout most of the material that we share, but also it's a kind of a common Strelka thing, where the group is essentially composed of architects and non-architects. We try to have a kind of even ratio of kind of 15-15. So architects, urbanists, and different kind of urban professionals on the one hand, and people who come from outside of the field. And this is the point of this is actually to make sure that we learn from the best practices that are part of the profession, with people with a proper, let's say, proper education and these kind of urbanism related topics, but also have insights that come from outside the discipline and kind of rattle the preconceptions that some of the architects might have. So a second common question that we get is, if I'm not an architect, if I'm not an urbanist, if I'm not a designer, what should I include in my portfolio? And the answer is pretty simple. Even if you're not a designer, even if you're not an architect, it's actually very interesting for us to see your portfolio. So the challenge of making a portfolio for a non-designer is one that I think is interesting, and also potential applicants should take quite seriously. So the portfolio requirements are pretty simple. We are usually looking for for a 10-page portfolio. And we basically ask applicants to kind of submit samples of their written work, potential projects or initiatives, or screenplays, whatever their work and their discipline is kind of focused on, a curated sample of their work in relation to how it might apply to the themes that we're interested in exploring with the terraforming. So these themes are obviously pretty not hidden. I mean, you guys have access, everyone has access to the research that we want to produce. So it's actually very interesting for us. How would you create a portfolio based on these representative of your work, of your interests, and also of your potential contribution to the research that we're interested in conducting this particular year, based on your given background. And this also applies to actually traditional architects and urbanists as well. So even if you are a designer, even if you are an architect and have a range of beautiful award-winning work and so on, please include or please curate your portfolio. Don't simply submit a portfolio that you would submit for a job application or so on. Like, think about the topics and think about why is it interesting for you, and what you could also contribute to the research from your work experience. This is extremely helpful for us in order to basically create the class composition, which is already quite varied and based not on picking the 30 best people who apply, let's say, best or most, let's say, people who drank the Kool-Aid, people who get the theory, people who get the it's not about creating a cult of the 30 people who get it. It's about creating an interesting group composition that would have various voices, and basically different researchers could benefit one another based on their particular skill sets and also expertise. So that's also a quite common question that I'm trying to address here as we're waiting for more questions to pop in on the chat. But no matter what your background is, please think about this 10-page portfolio as almost like a strategic design assignment, a strategic design don't overdo it. Don't feel like you have to do something that's like, simplicity and clarity is obviously the best possible strategy. But definitely give it some thought in terms of what's the order, what are the projects that would be interesting for us to see, what are the projects that you're particularly proud of, even though there might not be directly related to the topic. You might make them connected in an interesting kind of description. We review all the applications and we read all the portfolios. Give it some thought. Another question that we usually get is about the video recording. So just quite quickly to set everyone, or to make it as simple as possible, the video recording is something that you should not treat as part of an interview. We want to have it as stress-free as possible. Just think of it as a kind of a 1-minute introduction, where you introduce yourself, your education and professional background, and kind of tell us how you heard about Strelka and Terraforming, but in a very kind of informal way. Like, don't overdo this. Like, don't spend too much time worrying about this video. Just treat it. Be as relaxed as possible. Although I know it's kind of difficult sometimes, but just be natural and say a few words. And this is something that basically is the last thing we look at in the application. It's not something that's going to essentially tell us whether we should look at your portfolio or not. We look at all the applications, we read your answers and so on, but don't stress too much about this particular requirement. Cool. So we have a first question here on the portfolio guidelines. Okay, so are the portfolio requirements the same for all professionals, and should you add your CV to the portfolio? I think it's a good question. I think obviously the portfolios will look different because different disciplines have a kind of different, professional vernacular, and therefore they explain their work in different ways. The conventions of architecture, architectural portfolios look a certain way, which might be quite different from a researcher portfolio or from a kind of PhD candidate or journalist. The requirements are the same. Don't go over 10 pages. explain the projects simply. But what you could do, and what many applicants do also, is sometimes add a link to maybe your personal website, or a place on the internet where the project was expanded upon, and kind of maybe adds some additional clarity. There is no expectation that we will go to any online, just because you put it online doesn't mean we'll see it. So treat the portfolio as a 10-page self-sufficient thing. But obviously you can add websites and kind of other external links for some additional content and some additional clarification on the project. About your CV, it's not a requirement that you add a CV. I think we have some questions in the application form, which kind of ask you about your latest work experience, your kind of academic journey, and so on. So that's kind of taken care of in the application form. Don't feel like you should add your CV to the mix. And yeah, don't waste basically one of your 10 pages on the CV. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Yanni. Cool. Okay, well, while we're waiting for other questions, I'm wondering if I could focus on something else that might be interesting for... maybe I can continue going through the kind of common questions that we receive and see if that's kind of... Oh, we have another question by Claude. Does Strelka provide assistance for practical matters, visa, finding an apartment, etc.? Is travel paid or self-funded? Thanks, it's an important question. So the traveling to Russia is like traveling to come to Russia to take part of the program is at your own expense. So we don't sort of buy your plane tickets. If you get accepted, we don't fund your journey, your traveling to here. But the field trips that are part of the program are funded by Strelka. So once you're in Russia, we're going on 2 field trips over the course of the 5 months, plus a few local field trips here in Moscow and in the sort of region. So these field trips are funded by Strelka, not by you. In terms of the Russian visa, we assist the process. Usually the process is we send you a kind of an invitation that you have to take to the embassy, I think, and there's a few different things that you need to do, which are kind of more formal. So we provide that letter of invitation to you, and then back home you take care of the visa process. And then once you come in to Russia, then we register you, and there's a whole bunch of things that need to happen, which we assist you while you're here. In terms of finding an apartment, we have a pretty good network in terms of Strelka alumni and kind of a community here. So usually that's not, it's depends what you mean by assisted. We do help out in the process, but it's not like you come in and then there's an apartment waiting for you. Usually the first week of the program is a pretty exciting one because people are kind of, finalizing their accommodation. It's something that we help out with, but you don't apply to the program and then are provided accommodation for you to live in Russia. It's something that we kind of find as you arrive. Hopefully that answers, or I can go into more detail if you have additional questions. Cool. Happy that it clarifies. In terms of the question, would subtitles and image captions count as part of the max 150 words? No. Obviously, we're not going to count the words. The point is basically to be brief. So if captions help with clarity and would also require additional text, which goes up to 150 words, that doesn't mean it's totally fine. Essentially, the priority with the portfolios, I think, is basically to make sure that in this, we review a lot of applications, and we review a lot of really strong applicants kind of apply to the program. So it's more about how well you could communicate the particular idea in this kind of format of the portfolio. So whatever, I mentioned the simplicity because as a default, keep it simple. But if you find a strategy that actually helps out to convey the main point of a particular project, feel free to experiment what would be the best way to communicate it. So if you need captions are great. Yeah, basically be generous with the people reviewing the work, because sometimes the work is, obviously all the work that is being submitted by everyone here is quite rich and very difficult to summarize, and actually quite painful to summarize. Speaking as well as a designer, like sometimes it's very difficult to edit things out. So basically, be strategic about like what you include and what you don't include in order to help the reviewer understand the main point. Right. Given the compressed timing, what are the chances of learning any Russian? Very good question. I think people, I mean, the program is quite intense, but also it's nice because half of the cohort is Russian and the other half is international. We have more or less, I mean, in the new normal, over the course of the 3 years, we had people from over 30 different countries. Given the fact that half the program was Russian, many people kind of... Did I cut out?
No.
Oh, okay, sorry, still here. So yeah, learning Russian, it's a noble effort. What might happen is that through kind of hanging out with the Russian component of the group and through kind of this kind of total immersion in the Russian landscape, I'm sure you will pick up some Russian and you will pick up some kind of key knowledge to get by in Moscow. I would advise against trying to take classes to learn Russian. You just simply won't have the time to do it. I mean, the program is, again, already quite intensive in terms of the official program. In the unofficial part, there's a lot of work after hours. There's also like a quite active social life in Moscow. So chances are you might not have that much time to learn any Russian. If that's why you're applying to Strelka, you might actually not have the chance to do it. One of the requirements is Diploma Scan. Is it okay if it's in Russian? Yes, that's okay. If you hold dual citizenship, should you apply as a Russian citizen? I think you should apply as a Russian citizen if you hold dual citizenship. There's no, I mean, if by quota you mean half the group as a Russian, half the group as international, it would help us if you just sort of apply as a Russian citizen, so it's clear in terms of even the visa process. It simplifies a lot of our work. If you would apply as a Russian citizen in this case. Right. Maybe I speak too fast and I answer all these questions way too fast. Another word maybe about the application process while we're waiting for some more questions is that how it usually works is that you submit your application and your portfolio, and we review all the applications at least twice, or multiple people review the applications, and we kind of create a short list. And then we will send you an invitation for interviews on Skype, where we'll have a few days where you can sort of, you have a spot, and then we connect with you via Skype. For this, we will also probably send you an additional set of questions, not as a kind of a quiz, but more and kind of to prepare your interview. So given the fact that after the first stage, all the applicants are quite strong, we also try to basically send an additional set of questions to get the conversation going. So that being said, I think we shared the preliminary reading list that some of you might have seen online. So as much as you can kind of look into, even or I guess what I'm saying is that we use this kind of secondary layer of kind of conversation to not just like interview you, but also like you interview us in a certain way, and kind of see that this is essentially what you want to commit for, and do kind of set aside 5 months of your life to kind of work with us. So for that reason, we basically send you guys this kind of secondary level of layer of questions, and you can take a look at the reading list on the Strelka Mag. I think there's a Strelka Mag page, which was also part of the newsletter. Hopefully some of you guys are receiving. I can talk a lot, but it is helpful to have any questions from your side, so we can actually answer the right questions that you guys are interested in knowing about. Do we keep a note of what alumni go on to do afterwards? Like, we don't embed you with a tracker, but the Strelka community is actually quite like being here for 5 months, and also given the fact that the program is quite intense, we create, like, people get to know each other quite quickly, and somehow we create this community which, I mean, for better or worse, obviously mostly for better, somehow knows what everyone's up to, sometimes even years after the program. So Strelka as an institution obviously connects with its alumni through various newsletters, and there's a lot of opportunities to kind of be part of this network and be part of this community through events or workshops that we run with alumni, or events during the summer program, such as lectures. But also kind of informally, you'll probably stay in touch with most of the people. And this is also maybe a good segue into mentioning that this is the reason why we designed this program as a 3-year kind of cumulative research think tank, because previously Strelka always had like one class, one topic, one research agenda, and now we kind of moved on into creating this kind of ongoing process where researchers, it's a different group of 30 people each year, but they're kind of building on top of each other's research and kind of looking at, sometimes the same themes, sometimes the themes, drop out and we add new ones. Basically, we're trying to build this kind of cumulative body of work, which means that alumni from various years of the program, the first year, the second year, the third year of the cycle, are also kind of stay in touch and get to know each other quite well, which means at the end, instead of having a group of 30 people as the kind of core of alumni, you actually get to know about 90 people. Which has definitely been the case with the New Normal program, which has been a 3-year initiative, and most people are still quite keep in touch with one another. The minimum required experience is 2 years. Does it have to be 2 years without interruption? No, it's good. We just basically want to have people who have some work experience, who have it also shows in your application, in your portfolio, if you've done. Having more years of experience means you just have more and more work, and sometimes better work, although not always. So it doesn't have to be with or without interruption. We basically just want to see a body of work, not simply student work. In terms of this, and also in terms of the other requirements of the program, the kind of minimum requirements of the 2 years of experience and the age limit and so on, obviously we look at that, but if you feel like you don't have 2 years of experience, or you're not between 25 and 35, don't be discouraged in applying. In some cases, we've had people in the New Normal program who were under 25. We've had people who were over 35. We've had people who had potentially less than 2 years of professional experience. It doesn't mean that their contribution wasn't valued. It just means that they have a different role in the group. So all of these these guidelines are important, but also they're not like set in stone. If you feel strongly that you have something to contribute to the program and you can get something out of it, that will be apparent in your application, and we'll definitely review it. Okay, what kind of impact this makes on people's careers? Okay, so building onto just trying to go back to your. So do we keep a note of what the alumni are up to after the program, and do we help them with their careers? If that's kind of the question what kind of impact it makes on people's careers? I mean, there's many ways to think about this. Basically, because Strelka is not an accredited academic institution, there's no proper diploma, and it's actually sometimes quite hard to define what you actually learned. Obviously, there's a lot of personal growth and professional growth, but there's no kind of set template or set sort of metrics to determine whether this has helped you with your career or not. I think that obviously different people come to Strelka for different reasons, and some people, for example, come to Strelka and afterwards go back to their original careers, and then that usually helps them because they get a promotion or they have a different set of skills that essentially allows them to kind of pivot or grow in their own professional field. We have people who come to Strelka because they're looking at changing or expanding their own professional field, and therefore the impact on their career is much more disruptive, in a good way. Generally, after 5 months within this program, it's not like you're going to get more clarity per se. Like, it actually adds another layer of confusion, of productive confusion, and sometimes that's very beneficial for your career. So we definitely look at opportunities within our network and try to connect with the alumni when that's relevant. And in that sense, it does help to be part of the Strelka network, but it's not something that is kind of an official or kind of process which is kind of rigid or predetermined in any way. With regards to architect's application, is there a certain preference advantage for people from countries where discourse is more connected to Strelka's teams? I wouldn't say that there's a preference or advantage based on the countries. One of the fundamental requirements is actually to get a varied group, like geographically and professionally. So, for example, we do have some people from some countries, like more people might apply from the US, or more people might apply from Western Europe, and we won't take 15 people from the US or 50 people from Western Europe. So we try to have a proper distribution throughout the different countries that do apply to the program. So there is no advantage based on that. I think there's an advantage if you have taken the time to basically look at the information that's publicly available on the website. It does help to read the book and understand essentially the program themes and know the work of the faculty, because that usually shows in the answers that you provide to some of the kind of questions that we asked. But let's say that you simply were curious and looked at the website and looked at the program. I think there's enough material there to basically understand the discourse, at least the first layer of the discourse. And therefore, people who kind of know or have some awareness of what we're talking about are at an advantage, because they can actually have a productive conversation about some of the topics that we're interested in investigating. But I wouldn't say that you need to have read the stack and read every book of the faculty and understand a discourse as a precondition for applying. We don't take 30 people who are, again, part of this cult. The purpose is not to build a cult. The purpose is to get different people from different kind of areas, professional and geographic, and therefore that's the variety is what we're looking for. What part of Russia will students visit as a field trip? Very good question. It's still TBD, not because we don't know, but because we have a few different options, and we also are kind of working on not just in terms of what would be the cool city or a cool area to visit, but also the availability of the sites we want to visit, the experts that are there that actually are available for us to connect. So this is why we actually haven't finalized the Russian field trip, because there's a lot of factors in play. What kind of working experience do you value from your applicants? I think it's a good question. I just don't know if there's an answer for it, in the sense that it's good to have, in some cases, varied working experience. So to have multiple projects potentially at different scales or in different kind of industries. But it's also good to have some experts who have essentially an expertise they can bring. So I really think it depends. It's up to the applicant. If you feel like your strength as an applicant is your kind of specialty and your kind of expertise in the field of science, in the field of cinema, as a writer or as a researcher on a very specific topic, then it's maybe to your advantage to kind of craft your application to push that angle. If you feel like you've done, just as a person, you've done multiple different things in life, and your skill is basically being able to jump back and forth between different things and do interesting projects and connect them in interesting ways, then just craft your application as this. So there's no real, like I said, and like Benjamin said in the last week as well, we're trying to basically design the cohort as a group, as a unit. Therefore, it's not 30 people of the same. It's essentially trying to kind of mix and match different people and disciplines in order to create one cohesive working unit. So we'll have both experts and people who are maybe more on the generalist side. Do we take people who are still in their studies, product design, now doing a BA, etc.? So the program is very, very much full-time. So there's no opportunity to kind of be doing anything else on the side. So we prioritize people who are ready to commit full-time to this particular program. If you're, for example, a PhD student or a type of student that is like can afford and it's possible to take a break from your other studies to be part of the program, then that's not a problem at all. As long as you commit full-time to this particular thing, I guess it's fine if you haven't completed the master's or the PhD or the bachelor's that you're currently enrolled in. But if it's a situation where you have to complete other things on the side while you're at Strelka, this is just, pragmatically, it's quite difficult. Not just for us, but actually, as I mentioned, all the work is collaborative, and it's also working with your teammates who should be able to count on you as you're working on these different projects. So we really prioritize people who are not enrolled in anything else, or at least who are able to suspend the other projects that they have during the course of the 5 months and be committed full-time to this particular research program. Hopefully that answers, Victor. Regarding the professional experience, do we have some preconceptions of what, regarding the professional experience, do you have some preconceptions of what character this work should be? I'm going to go back to Hussein's question. So, no, I don't think we have any preconceptions about the type of work that we need to see. Obviously, we want the portfolio to be kind of tailored to you. The portfolio is essentially a manifestation or representation of your core skill set, interest, and potential contribution to the unit, to the think tank. So I think you should tailor it as much as possible to yourself and your own background. It's different from, let's say, like a work application or work CV where there's a particular job that you're applying for, and therefore you need to make sure that everything that you do tells that story. Of course, the portfolio, whether you want it or not, will tell a story. So I think it's good to be conscious of that and sort of choose what kind of story you want to tell with your portfolio based on again, what you think you could gain from the program and what you think you could add to the group. So in that case, there's no expectations. I think the default is clarity, and the default is the ability to showcase your strengths, and the work sort of follows that. Some applicants, for example, have done projects specifically for the portfolio, like giving the fact that the terraforming is a very specific area of research. Some people might write a piece specifically on those topics or do a competition about this. It's not a requirement to do that. It's not also, we're not against that either. Like, just show work that sort of speaks to your interests, speak to your strength, and you'll be fine. Victor, you meant a break between the studies. So if the question was if you were doing some studies and then you interrupted them for 5 months and then you're going to go back to the studies, then that's totally fine for us. The only requirement is basically that you have the time, both physical and cognitive, intellectual commitments, the headspace. You have to be in the headspace to be able to contribute to and work with the rest of the group. The TOEFL. I think if you have any specific questions on that, you can definitely email apply@strelka.com. I think it may be a case-by-case answer, the one about the TOEFL. If you've been working and living abroad for a few years and have a master's diploma from let's say, university in English, just specify that in the email, and we'll be able to tell you if that's fine. Any suggestions on how many projects our portfolio should have? Well, you have 10 pages. So in some cases, people choose to show 10 projects, one a page, which could be fine. In some cases, people might show 3 projects, but spend a bit more time on them. I think this is a decision that you have to take based on the type of work that you have. And like I said, feel free to include on the last page a link to like an online portfolio or a website or anything else that you think might be relevant. Like I said, it doesn't mean that you should expect that the reviewers will go to it. So select the most relevant projects. If it's 20, it's 20. It's just up to you to decide whether do you have enough space to actually explain them, but on the other hand, you might be applying from the point of view of like a graphic artist or someone with a more technical background, in which case essentially the project needs less written explanation. It may be more tech heavy or image-based. So it's really a case-by-case. Decision. About the portfolios, because like we've been reviewing a lot of portfolios over the past 2 years. Really, I just can't emphasize this enough. Like just the clarity of communication and the clarity of, this is the project, this is why, this was the approach, this is why it's important, this is why it's interesting, this is why it matters to your program. Like, don't be afraid of, don't just paste your artist statement and assume that the lyrical language, which unpacks the project, is enough. I mean, it doesn't mean you don't have to include it, but it really does help. It also shows the ability to edit, synthesize, and kind of think strategically. Treat this as a design project, your portfolio. And therefore, if you decide that for you it makes sense to show 20 projects, then do 20 projects. There's no standardized format other than the fact that we want 10 pages, A4. And I should also mention that we don't print out these portfolios. We look at them on screens. So it may be helpful for you to know that if you prioritize a kind of a horizontal format, it might be also better, just because that's the way that we'll look at the portfolio on the screen. Are the portfolio requirements strict parameters? Can someone exceed the word or page limits? I mentioned earlier you can probably exceed the word limit. If you're a writer, it's difficult to kind of, we would appreciate, like, obviously, I think there might even be a formal requirement to add an abstract to any written piece, but 150 words is a good length in terms of how much time someone can spend. You can obviously add as a reference the full piece, even if it's 40 pages, but the portfolio itself should be 10 pages, just because it's honestly, like, sometimes it's enough. If it's 11 pages because you chose to have a title page, that's also fine. Like, we're not gonna we're not gonna kick you out because you had 11-page portfolio. But if you do send like a 56-page artist portfolio, then it actually might not be to your advantage, because we might just not have time to look at. It also means that you actually didn't take the time to review the requirements, which also says. Also communicates about your how seriously you took the application. Andrea, photographer, how strict is the limit of 10 pages? I just answered. It's pretty strict in the sense that if you treat the portfolio as a device to communicate something about your potential role and contribution as an applicant, then take the 10 pages and decide the story you want to tell in these 10 pages. If on the last page you want to add a link to your whatever website or Instagram profile or whatever, where we can see the rest of your work, then that's also fine. But please think of this 10-page portfolio as a kind of as a design project in itself, as something that you're doing for this application. As opposed to just submitting your professional portfolio that you would submit elsewhere, which obviously in many cases would probably have to exceed 10 pages. So we would really appreciate if you stuck to the format of 10 pages plus maybe a title page if you really think you need it. So I'm going to have some water while you guys think about more questions. Anka, can we add only student projects because work projects are too far from terraforming topic? Yes, I mean you could. Yes, don't feel like you have to add. If you worked in 10 different offices, for example, don't feel like you have to add a project from each office. Like that's definitely not the best strategy. I think it's good to show some work that is kind of that you're proud of, that is relevant to the skill set that you have and that you think represents your contribution. I think it would help to add some work projects simply because it also shows us potentially how you've managed to take some of these ideas and bring them into a different context. So it doesn't have to be like work projects per se, but it's good that you show some range in the work, because sometimes that also might help to communicate the how you've expanded upon a particular skill set, or how you moved beyond, a particular academic program onto the next thing. TOEFL and this, how much is that necessary for Russian applicants? It's pretty necessary. I think we require the TOEFL for all the applicants who are not from an English-speaking country. Again, I'm not entirely. I don't want to say something that's flat out wrong or incomplete. So I think the best approach is really to email the Strelka, apply@strelka.com, and give it, ask your specific question. I think they'll be much better suited at answering that particular question. I guess while we're waiting again for some more questions, I can talk a little bit about the process of the program. I think we outlined this on the website, but it's also worth repeating that you'll, at the end of the program, what usually gains the most visibility is the so-called final projects. So, for example, in the case of the normal, each year we had from 7 to 8 final projects, which really researchers do over the span of sort of 6 to 7 to maybe 8 weeks. And they're not so much final projects, because 8 weeks is actually quite short, but they're something like a first public presentation of the work that they produce. So even though that's kind of the visible end outcome, the program is kind of structured into these three to four different phases. So in the case of the terraforming, we're going to continue with a similar structure. Well, we'll have essentially an immersion period where the first few weeks of the program, it's basically setting the theoretical foundation and the kind of theoretical and, for lack of a better word, speculative design foundation for the type of design research that we'll be conducting, which is the first phase, where it's composed of very short, very kind of successive design charrettes, which are usually led by a faculty, along with myself and the tutors that we have here. And then there's basically, the point here is not to produce, of course, we want to produce beautiful work, but the point here is actually to kind of exercise and prototype and test different ideas in quite fast. So at the end of that process, we have, before the final projects, I would say we usually have around 100 to 150 projects, because groups, the researchers work in small groups, produce a project, and then afterwards we archive everything. There's a kind of a project report kind of archiving process, and we basically are trying to build a common pool of work, a common pool of references, where through doing it, not all the projects are good, and that's fine, but the projects are essentially trying to create a common vocabulary of concepts. And again, the goal here is to kind of break apart the sense of kind of ownership of like your idea, my idea, this guy's idea. It's basically to create a kind of common pool of references that are essentially useful for the final projects afterwards. So the way the program is set up in this kind of very quick process, very kind of a tense process, which is interrupted by the field trips. And this year also will be interrupted by a short research module, which will be focused on the topic of space, which is also kind of expanded upon, I think, on the website. We'll be looking at, usually within the program, we try to combine design with a research component, and because we wanted to build some time in the program to actually investigate a topic a bit longer, we have a space module, which we'll do here with a created set of faculty as well. So basically, the point is that the process is a successive build-up to this final project's delivery, but everything that we do before essentially is folded into the final projects in some way or another. Andrew, what types of writing experience or skills do you look for? Yes, so if you've published a mix of journalism, academic work, and reviews, this is all quite interesting and relevant for us. So if you want to include some of that work in the portfolio, even if it's not relevant to the terraforming topic, I think it's worth accompanying that work with a short abstract about essentially the context in which that work was created, just to give us a bit more context about the work itself. Obviously, if you're including work in your portfolio, of sort of written sample, it shows your ability as a kind of a researcher, as a journalist, and as a writer. It also is helpful to see what was the context that led to this particular piece. So if you're doing that, it's definitely worth including it, but definitely use your 150 words to provide some context into that particular piece. Hopefully that helps, and that applies actually to all disciplines who don't have any kind of normative architectural or urban work to show. Are there any applicant interviews before final acceptance to the program? Yes. So the application process is pretty much on November 1st, we have the final pool of applicants. And that means we have all of the portfolios, applications, videos, and so on. We take a few weeks to review those, and we take that quite seriously because we want to give everyone a chance to we want to be fair and take the time with each application. So it might take a little bit of time. But at the end of this process, Benjamin, myself, team of alumni, the other tutors, we create a short list of applicants, and then we send them a kind of a follow-up message with interview time and with this additional set of questions, which are, they're not, again, it's not a quiz. They're basically like conversation starters and things that help applicants prepare for the conversation so we can have a productive kind of exchange. The interview lasts around 20 minutes, 20 to 25 minutes. And the Russian applicants usually do that in person. So we have a day set aside for people who are local to kind of come to Strelka and take part in the admission workshop where we speak to them in person. Everyone else we speak to remotely on Skype over the course of 3 days. And then in some cases, we might do follow-up interviews to make sure that you speak to multiple people in the team, and we have a good range of also people who have spoken to you and can make this. We can make an informed decision, basically. Also, just to mention about the interviews, I think I already mentioned it briefly, but we think of these interviews not essentially as us interviewing you, but really more of a kind of a mutual conversation, because the program is quite intense and because it does require a kind of commitment to kind of come to Russia and focus on these topics in the serious way that we kind of expect. It's also for you to ask questions to us and make sure that you're kind of that you know what you're signing up for, and this is also something you want to do. So it's less of an interview and more of a kind of a conversation. So it's definitely more of a dialogue. It's not us kind of sitting back and listening and you talking. It's much more about getting a chance to have a conversation with one another. But yes, 1 to 2 interviews. Hopefully that answers Sada. Joanna, how relevant is it to have a strong writing practice? If you're a writer, it's quite relevant. If you're not a writer and you're a designer, let's say it's not like we will judge you based on your written kind of practice, or it's not like we're going to be kind of focusing on that component, beyond the others. It just simply it's important to be a good. It's important to communicate your projects and your work in a kind of an effective way. So yes, it is important to be able to communicate in a written form. This year, the final projects will focus on. It's interesting because we actually don't really. It also depends on the group. We don't have any kind of predetermined formats that we're kind of expecting, but we definitely want to focus a bit more on cinema and text, and essentially try to reinvent, break them and bend them apart, kind of reinvent the medium of both. So having a good skill set and that discipline would be important. Being able to write and to express your ideas in written form is definitely it's definitely appreciated and definitely a key skill. But that being said, as well, if you applying from the point of view of an architect or from the from a different disciplines, then if that's not your strongest kind of feature, or you feel somehow that you can present your work in different ways, please make sure that the word you present speaks to your ability and to your potential contribution. What kind of research tools are available? Subscriptions, portals with academic papers? That's also a good question. So Strelka is not an academic institution, so it's not like there's a JSTOR or kind of the subscriptions are pretty. Let's say we don't have a standardized package. In the case of the final projects, there is a budget associated to each project, and in some cases, some of the teams may choose to spend that in getting a subscription or something like this. That is available as a resource, but as a general rule, we don't really have any kind of, at least not that I know of. I mean, it doesn't mean that we can't get. It just maybe it's a conversation that is a bit more specific, and it would depend what subscription, what portal. I mean, I don't know if I should say this. You can find a lot of stuff on ARG, for example, or different resources. And in the case where we have faculty come in with suggested readings that come from them, very often they share with us kind of a paper that's maybe was published in a magazine, or maybe it's not published yet. So these are meant for kind of internal consumption, internal use, and not for external distribution. So we have a common Google Drive where a lot of the kind of material that was shared with us is available, especially from the normal program. So that will be also made available to the researchers of this next program. But the expectation is that this stays as a kind of a resource for the group and isn't really shared outside of it. So I don't know if that actually answers your question. In terms of other kind of resources available, Strelka is a pretty kind of, I don't know what the buzzword would be, like, agile. Like it's pretty. We have a studio where the researchers work. We have a room with Wi-Fi and a big screen, and that's essentially it. There's no computer lab. There's no like digital fabrication lab. There's no It's not like a school where we have because the program is it's a non-profit research program. We don't have available facilities on site to do that kind of stuff. And it doesn't mean that you can't do it, but it basically means that sometimes in the final projects, when people need more specific tools or resources, they use some of the budget available to them to actually get what they actually need. So good. Happy that it answers. Don't be shy if you have any other questions. I think this is a good opportunity to ask and hopefully help to clarify some of the questions you might have about working at Strelka, living in Russia, applying to the program, after the program, and so on. I'm the design tutor of the program, but I was also an alumni of Strelka before, so I can also give you a bit of an answer from the alumni perspective as well, if you guys have any questions on this as well. Andrew, in the past, were students at Strelka able to learn Russian while studying as a side skill? I think yes. I mean, some people are better with language than others. I think if you do get accepted and you want to do some Duolingo before coming, it will be helpful for you, because outside of the kind of the Strelka bubble, it would be handy to kind of know a few Russian words. The best way to learn Russian is actually to kind of work with your colleagues, local colleagues, and essentially try to go out of the comfort zone, which is Strelka, and try to essentially learn on the go at parties and so on. The Institute does not organize classes for the international students to learn Russian. Yeah. every year we have people who essentially walk to Strelka, like listening to like an audiobook or something in Russian. They pick up a few words, but it's not kind of a core feature of the program to teach Russian. Victor, the stipend mentioned in the website, does it cover all costs? So just so I know, so I don't say something wrong, the stipend, which is about 40,000 rubles, 39,000 rubles, it amounts to around $600. So it doesn't, I guess it depends on your lifestyle. It probably will cover the cost of rent if you're renting a room, although it depends also on the room and where you want to live. But usually it's I don't know if you should assume that it will be enough to live monthly. So the program is non-profit, and we don't want to charge any students because we basically want to keep it free, not just free, but actually pay you the stipend. But it's not necessarily a stipend that will cover all of your costs. It's a stipend that I think we maintain because it's useful, but also symbolically, it's not a for-profit education program, and we don't want the students or the researchers to see themselves in a position of education as a service where they're paying money and therefore they expect stuff back. Of course, you should expect something from the institution, but it's much more of a mutual agreement of we provide the platform, we provide the experts, we pay for the experts' flights and so on, and we pay for the researchers' travels and so on, and we kind of expect in return sort of taking it seriously and being motivated to learn. So the stipend is more of a kind of, it's part of that agreement. It won't cover everything, but it will definitely help you to find a room in Moscow, and also potentially, have a drink at the bar on Fridays. Could you give some examples of the past final projects? All of the, Strelka this is a new program, and we don't yet have any examples of the type of work that we necessarily think we will produce. If it's any kind of indication of the type of work that could come out of the program, it would be helpful to look at the New Normal website, the newnormal.strelka.com, where all of the projects are featured. In the previous cycle, we were looking at projects that were kind of at the end, sort of urbanism, software policy, and think of projects that essentially were, cinematic, but also the design of tools, the design of platforms, and so on. I think with this particular program, we're looking at projects that are more cinema-based. So it might be helpful, for example, to look at some of the cinematic projects from the previous year to see if this is the kind of stuff that you'd be interested in working on. It doesn't mean that this is the project that we will be producing this year, because part of the challenge of this program is actually to look at, invent or reinvent a medium of communication, a medium of design through the merging of, architectural drawings, cinema, and then writing, and try to basically create projects that are an amalgamation of these different media. So you can look at these projects on the website. So on the website we have the description, the kind of the official description that was produced at the time of the program. So the kind of the first public presentation at the end of the program. But as I mentioned, many of the projects take on a life after the program. And this is why also all of the projects should have a website, which is also kind of indicated in our website. And then many of these projects continue after the program, and therefore sometimes take a life of their own afterwards. Another important thing is that we don't like to think of the final project as in this is the final project. The final projects are essentially an idea, a concept, kind of a first, a prototype, and they may take on different forms. So depending on the audience, the final project has a kind of a 10-minute film, but it also has a white paper, it also has a trailer, it also has a website, it also has a keynote, it also has a different keynote based on a different audience. So we're basically trying to create each project is kind of its own universe where different instances kind of are ejected or are solidified depending on the audience that the project is trying to target. So I mentioned in the beginning that Strelka stands for Institute for Media Architecture and Design. The media component of the program is also quite important, and we think quite seriously about not just the production of interesting ideas, but also the broadcasting and the communication of these ideas to a range of different audiences. So based on the audience, the project might take on a very different format. So the project will have a sort of final shape during the public presentations that we have here in the end of June. But they also take on different formats depending on where they're situated afterwards. So many of the projects end up being exhibited. The films end up being projected at various different festivals, and depending on the length, they change slightly, which is totally fine. So it's hard to give an example of a specific project, because part of the mandate here is actually to kind of try to reinvent the format itself. What particular mix of cinema and text could sort of be created for the purposes of the project itself. Hopefully that answers, but I'm happy to clarify. How are the dynamics? How are the dynamics to form the teams for each project? Right. So it's a good question. So we try to have basically our there's no what we want to do is we want to give the chance to everyone to work with everyone before we make the final groups for the final project. So usually also to be honest with everyone, like we make the final groups. We are the ones who each week try to assemble the group. The only criteria here is to make sure that everyone works with everyone else. So we kind of keep track of who worked with who in order to kind of shift the teams around and give the opportunity for everyone to work with everyone else. So it kind of alleviates a little bit the stress of having to make a group each week. It doesn't mean that some weeks we don't say, okay, you guys pick your teams this week. That's also kind of fine, because sometimes you actually want to work with someone again or test a collaboration or so on. So we usually create the final teams. We create the intermediate teams, and we usually create the final teams with some level of feedback, anonymous feedback from you throughout the process. So each week there's kind of an archiving process where the team submits his work and also has feedback forms, and we take the feedback quite seriously, because beyond, or at least in the case of the new normal, and I think this will continue to be the case with the terraforming, the design of the program itself is its own kind of design project. So we are learning from each iteration, we're learning from each workshop what can we do differently next week, because we don't have any standards to follow. We're not accredited. We don't have to follow any guidelines from any government or so on. We're essentially very free to experiment with the format and with the teams and so on. So we try to create the teams and to shift things around based on the feedback that we get from the students weekly. But if the question was about the dynamics of the final teams, then we've made the final teams in most cases. In some cases, people have actually asked to work together. In our experience, actually, it doesn't really guarantee that it's neither the best projects nor the most painless processes come from the people who make their own teams. In most cases, when we have made the teams, they've actually worked out fine. And in very minimal cases, we've also kind of shifted things around slightly afterwards because of different reasons. Usually it works quite well. Nuno, Benjamin mentioned last week we should all bring a camera. Would that be able to personal use or be necessary for the program? Also a very good question. So yes, we do mention that the projects will be cinematic, will be film based. Strelka doesn't have like an equipment lab to kind of give out equipment to the students, so it is important for you to bring your equipment, not just your camera, but also the software, the computers, and so on. Everyone works on their own sort of tech. So it would be important for the program to bring any type of professional tools that you have. If you're a filmmaker, then we would expect that you would bring your own camera for the work. But even for personal use, it's just good to bring a camera, because we go on multiple field trips and you will regret it afterwards if you don't. Hopefully that answers. Seda, will the travel to and from Moscow be covered? No, not the. I mean, for the international field trip, yes. Everything that we do during the program in terms of field trips will be covered, official travels. But you traveling to Russia to come to the program and you traveling back home afterwards is not covered by the program. So basically, when you arrive here as a researcher, you get your first stipend after the first month. And essentially, you receive a monthly stipend up until the end for 5 months. And we buy the plane tickets and we arrange the accommodations when we travel. So that's what's covered. Everything else is not. So the travel is not covered to and from Moscow. So still 46 people watching, 47 now. If you guys have any questions, I can sort of stand there, but it's also good to keep the conversation going. Otherwise, I can go into something else, but let me check maybe at other common questions. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to, I don't, okay. Amiyam, what kind of workshops will there be in the Terraforming program? So it's a good question. We will try to basically have kind of a successive, so basically what we want to do is we want to curate and design the process of the program as it's going on. So we have a kind of a, we have a schedule. We have the faculty that's kind of committed to be part of the program, which is also available on the website. So how it works is we usually we invite a particular faculty. There's no full-time faculty here in Russia other than myself, and the people come for a particular workshop, and they usually come with a particular brief, which is specific to the topics, but also to their own personal interests. So because I keep mentioning, we think of this program not as a sort of school or education, not as an academic program where there's students and there's professors, but really as a kind of common think tank. We also ask the faculty themselves to see themselves as researchers. So we invite the faculty to actually kind of come up with a particular experiment that they want to look into and test out basically on the group that we have assembled. For them, it's quite interesting because the group of 30 people ends up being a quite atypical kind of composition of people and various kind of viewpoints and interests. So they themselves come in with a particular research question, of course connected to terraforming, but it varies. In some cases, the workshop is basically based on someone's particular work, where it's a prompt for a design brief to look at a particular site or a particular research question. In some cases, it's based maybe more on the application of like a tool, like exploring the project, not from the perspective of the concept, but from the perspective of what the tool can offer, and learning the tool in the process, like in a case of a GIS or any other type of kind of technical platform. So it is really quite varied. The kind of, I guess, the unifying thread is that each one of them is kind of seen as a self-standing experiment, a self-standing kind of project. And at the end, all the work is kind of being submitted and archived. And honestly, you kind of forget about it because the next project, the next workshop comes in quite fast. But at the end, before the final projects, we also kind of share the list of all of the work, all the project descriptions and the images and so on, for people to kind of like remember what they did and kind of pull ideas from this kind of common body of knowledge. So again, just to reiterate, just because we did a particular project in week 4 of the program doesn't mean that the ideas expressed here are yours or even that group's, because at the end you kind of forget even who came up with these ideas. It's more about like, okay, here's a common set of references from this kind of successive array of workshops. What sticks, what's useful, and what is worth experimenting on further for the final projects. So with this in mind, the short projects are meant to basically provide the opportunity to explore a range of different topics and really test out a range of different collaborations in the group itself, so we can actually create a common body of references. What will there be any workshops on the terraforming open for non-students? Also a good question. I think this, I guess the short answer would be no. Like we have obviously everything the institute does is meant to be for public kind of broadcasting, but we don't want to open up the process of the workshops themselves as they're going on to the exterior world for many reasons. Obviously, it's a question of trust, and we want people who are in the program to feel free to experiment on stuff without being worried like every single one of these short charrettes will be in the world and will represent my portfolio for the rest of time because it's online. Like we don't want to open up the design process as it's happening to non-students, to the exterior world. I mean, in some cases, like people's significant other or like their friend comes to visit like for one day in Moscow, they can sit in a lecture. We're not going to kick anyone out. But if someone sort of like comes in and sort of starts staying as a kind of a constant feature in the program, it's not something that we want to do or we've done in the past. So this group of 30 people that we have is essentially a tight group. And the program is meant to be for those 30 people in the ZAL as they're doing the work. Also, we have a Slack channel. So a lot of this communication also happens digitally and online. So, for example, in the case of the New Normal program, and it will also be the case on the Terraforming program, the cohort from the first year, for example, is not kicked out of the Slack. So we have some common channels, like some shared channels where we share links and kind of ongoing work, or references, or even like random stuff, which is available for all the people who are part of the program, including the previous years. But also some channels are private for that particular year, so that it really does feel like it's a tight, it's a kind of a closed circle. So hopefully that answers. It's not that we don't want to like share some of the content with non-students, but we find that actually we produce better work internally if we're actually allowed to disconnect a little bit from the outside world for a little bit and kind of test out different iterations and different projects without being worried that we're being judged by kind of external people. So that's part of the reason why we also don't want to open it up to other people. George, do we also cover meals, or are they supposed to be covered by the stipend? Yes, if you eat, it's covered by the stipend. We don't offer meals. I mean, we're here on sort of the Strelka Islands. There's a lot of kind of sort of various, from cheap to semi-cheap to expensive options, depending on your sort of taste and budget. We have the bar, which is connected right next to the institute, which offers a lunch menu, which is usually kind of relatively, I don't know if it's cheap. It's accessible. It's accessible. It's cheap-ish. We also have a discount card for all the students, 20% at the Strelka bar, which also helps. But the meals are not covered, so we don't provide any kind of. Again, the accommodations and meals and so on are covered by the stipend, which you kind of dispose of. I should also say that the stipend is made available at the end of the month. So, for example, you get your stipend in your bank account at the end of the month. So when you will arrive here in February, if you're accepted, you will get the first stipend on the 1st of March, for example. So that's kind of important also if you want to think about that as well. Hopefully that answers. I'm looking at other stuff, but feel free to jump in. I mean, one other common question, I guess I'm just looking at the emails and the stuff that we get here, is about the kind of vacation time, the rest time. We keep talking about how intense the program is. It is kind of intense in terms of an experience. We do try to stick to weekends, but overall, it really is like a full-time commitment. And the two field trips have like different functions. The Russian field trip is meant as a kind of it's its own workshop. Actually, it's the film, the first kind of film, like dedicated film fieldwork workshop that we do with Liam Young. And the international field trip is more seen as a kind of a research field trip. But again, these are not vacation, but they're a bit like almost like moving outside of the room and being kind of in the field. Other than that, again, the expectation is that you'll be in Moscow for the full duration of the 5 months, which is also why we actually made the program slightly shorter than it used to be. Originally, the program was supposed to be 9 months, but we progressively have decided that 5 months is a better, like people can take a break as much from their normal lives for 5 months. So in that sense, the vacation is kind of like usually people take a long summer off after the intensity of the program. So yeah. All right. I mean, I've been talking for an hour and a half, so I'm also happy to stop. But I think if you guys have any final questions or anything that you want to sort of get out of the way while we're here on the chat, feel free. If not, I'm also happy to check out. So does it have to be TOEFL or IELTS? I think it depends on it's a case-by-case thing, and the best thing for these kind of questions, although I appreciate that you're trying to find questions to ask me, so thank you, Seda. It could be either, I think. But again, if you want the specific kind of administrative details, always best to double check with my colleagues at Apply website, so they'll be able to answer. All right. So if you guys give me the approval by saying that it's all good, then I'm happy to I mean, and it's we if you have any questions, you can also feel free to email us at the Apply website. Maybe some final words or something. I don't know. Basically, the advice for people who would consider applying, because again, you can't really defer your application. If you get accepted this year and you choose to not come to the program for any reason, it doesn't mean that you get to be accepted for next year. Basically, think about whether this is something that you'd be interested in doing, and also think about, is it even possible for you to commit to the 5-month effort? And that should be basically enough to apply. Don't feel like you're not good enough because you don't have enough work experience or anything that makes it seem like, oh, I don't have 3 years yet, so maybe I should apply next year. If you feel like there's something interesting to you, we definitely encourage you to apply. If you don't get accepted in the first kind of run, it doesn't mean that we kind of blacklist you. On the contrary, every year we have many people who have applied multiple times to the program. So if this is something that you feel like could be interesting and would benefit your personal work, or you think that you have a strong something to add to the group, honestly, even though we kind of hype it up and it's like, oh, so many people apply and it's such a great program, definitely don't feel shy about applying. We definitely look at all the applications, and we will try to give the attention to each application as it comes. Elise, if about the anecdotes, kind of I don't know if I have any nice final inspirational words. I can just say that myself, I was a student. I was a researcher, I should say, at Strelka during the 2015-16 year, and it's actually been really rewarding to kind of continue to be part of this effort, because as an architect, I feel like a lot of designers have this kind of feeling that the profession needs to change, and we need to kind of adapt our skill set and adapt our methodology and our mentality. I came to Strelka with the hope that it was going to help me to find that, to clarify what's the path forward. And the honest truth is that I don't know if you're confused before applying to Strelka, I don't honestly think that you'll be less confused when you leave. But I think you'll be probably confused in a better, in a more productive way. Like, it's a productive confusion. I think it doesn't provide any answers. And having been here now for the last program, which we're currently we're working on this big publication, we want to kind of share the findings. There definitely are some insights in terms of but there's no clear answer to whatever personal and professional confusion that you had. But it definitely provides a certain kind of a productive lens through which you see your own career and your own kind of involvement in this question of what is the city. I think it basically will continue to be a strange experience, but at least you'll meet people who are equally confused. And that's really, it really does sound cheesy, but the most important thing is really the kind of the people that you'll meet here and the kind of projects that you'll continue to work on after the program. Even if it's beyond the particular projects that you did at Strelka, people keep on collaborating on multiple things together and really have found a kind of sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Similar spirits. Obviously, many people end up finding, partners and kinship and all sorts of different kind of collaborations afterwards. So if nothing else, the kind of experience, the social experience of being part of this program is really, really, really worth it. So this is why I really want to emphasize, even if you feel like the teams are foreign to you, and sometimes the discourse, the academic discourse could be intimidating, it is for everyone, and at least we'll be kind of looking at these ideas together, and it's really a unique opportunity to be part of a group that are confused in the same direction and are kind of looking for common threads together. So sorry if that's kind of a bit on the kind of TED Talk side. It wasn't my intention, but it is true. So if that's all, thank you once again for kind of being part of the webinar. I think it is available online afterwards. So if someone didn't see it, or if you guys want to see it again for whatever reason, it will be made available. And please don't hesitate to send us any questions you may have on the apply@strelka.com email. All right. Thank you so much, and have a good rest of the application process or life, I guess. Thanks.